Washington, D.C., the summer of 1960. Into the Congressional Record, the official, permanent transcript of the United States Congress, goes a signed statement about flying saucers. The signature is what makes it news. Roscoe Henry Hillenkoetter, Naval Academy, class of 1919, 20th in a class of 467. Naval attaché in Paris and Vichy under two ambassadors, working with the French underground. Wounded at Pearl Harbor on the deck of the West Virginia. Builder of Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Intelligence Center. And from 1947 to 1950, the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The first man to hold that office under the 1947 Act. And what the first director of Central Intelligence tells Congress over his own signature is that behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are seriously concerned about the UFOs, and that official secrecy and ridicule have misled the public. He has already stated publicly that the unknown objects are, his words, real and not visionary. It is the single greatest credibility coup in the history of the civilian UFO movement. The New York Times reports it. NICAP will live off it for years. 3 years later, the same man sits down and writes a private letter to Harvard's Donald Menzel, the era's most relentless UFO debunker, to praise Menzel's new book for
putting to rest all surmises about flying saucers being from outer space.
By 1970, in further private letters, he is denying he ever said the objects were under intelligent control at all. Extended, withdrawn. This episode is about those two motions, performed over 23 years by an admiral, a colonel, and a manager with a ledger, until the most respected civilian UFO organization in America is a mailing list in someone else's filing cabinet. The flags on this episode are contested and documented side by side. We will tell you every time which one we are holding.
When I started pulling files on NICAP's board, Hillenkoetter was the name I circled first. Everyone does. The first CIA director demanding UFO disclosure? Either that's the biggest whistleblower in American history, or something else is going on. Here's what I didn't expect. The document UFO researchers hold up to prove he was a true believer, a 1987 paper called The Admiral and the UFOs, has his recantation letters attached in its own appendix. One file, both sides of the argument. That file is this episode.
This is the Deception Thread, Episode 7, Extend and Withdraw. May the 1st, 1957. Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter retires from the United States Navy. Within weeks, he has a seat on NICAP's Board of Governors, invited by its new director, Donald Kehoe. The two men go back 4 decades, Naval Academy classmates. Remember where Episode 6 left this organization, reshuffled, respectable, hungry for establishment stature. Now it holds the ultimate credential, and NICAP does not hide it. It advertises it. The first issue of its bulletin, the UFO Investigator, July 1957, welcomes the Admiral with a biography that reads like an intelligence resume. Attaché postings in Paris, Madrid, Lisbon, Vichy, intelligence chief on the Pacific Command Staff, and touts his service as director of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Say the flag, documented and overt. Whatever this was, it was not hidden. The CIA tie was the selling point.
That's worth sitting with, because the lazy version of this story is the CIA secretly infiltrated NICAP. The record is stranger. NICAP put former CIA director on the brochure. If you're building credibility in 1957, intelligence men are what credibility looks like. The overlap between the people who kept secrets and the people who chased saucers wasn't a hidden wire. It was the water everybody swam in. Which is exactly what makes intent so hard to adjudicate. And why this episode keeps 2 flags in the air at once.
And that same first issue of The Investigator carries something else. The reason this episode's second flag reads documented, pages 8 and 9. In the organization's first months, 3 news stories move, or appear to move, on the Associated Press teletype. A flaming object crashes in the Florida Everglades. A Seminole man is hospitalized with radiation burns. Radio and television are knocked out across Miami. Dramatic, connected, and fake, all 3. No crash, no burns, no blackout. The dispatches were counterfeits, formatted to pass as AP wire copy and fed to NICAP. NICAP smelled the fraud and ran it down with the cooperation of the Associated Press and the Federal Communications Commission. The trail ended at one of its own member investigators, a man who had worked teletype communications in the Army Signal Corps. NICAP printed the whole affair in that first bulletin, reproduced the 3 fake dispatches, and called it what it looked like: a plot to discredit the organization.
Think about the skill set, not the content. Anyone can invent a saucer crash. The format. Wire copy has a grammar, slugs, datelines, timing. To counterfeit it convincingly, you need signals training. The man who did it had exactly that. Episode 3 built a whole hypothesis on the idea that wire copy could be seeded, and that remains a hypothesis. This is different. This is a documented 1957 signals-trained fabrication of wire service copy, run against the leading civilian UFO group in its first year of life. Who sent him, whether anyone sent him, the record doesn't say, and neither will we. But keep the technique in your pocket. You'll see it again in the 1980s.
The same issue documents the credibility war from the other side. The Air Force press desk was circulating a form letter assuring correspondents that no UFO books had ever been cleared by the Air Force. NICAP prints the receipts. Ruppelt's insider account, cleared by Security and Review for Doubleday on December the 5th, 1955. Kehoe's own flying saucers from outer space, built on 51 declassified intelligence items, 42 of them officially analyzed cases. The clearance is verified by a lieutenant colonel in the Directorate of Air Force Intelligence. The Air Force had also coordinated flying saucer articles in the Saturday Evening Post, in Life, in Look, and analyzed 2 UFO films it released for public use. Sit with what that means. The defining exposés of the cover-up, the books that made the cover-up a household idea, were themselves cleared, sanctioned releases of the very institution they accused.
There's a mundane version of that finding. Of course, a former officer's book goes through clearance review. That's the rule, not a plot. And there's a version that should keep you up at night. The public fight about the secret was itself conducted through approved channels. The denial and the exposé had crossed the same desks. Episode 5 said you don't have to fake the sky to control the story about it. This is what that looks like in a bookstore.
One more artifact from that first bulletin, because it shows how a managed narrative propagates even through honest hands. NICAP's own 8-point plan describes the CIA's January 1953 scientific panel, the Robertson Panel, which Episode 5 reconstructed from the declassified record, and states on Ruppelt's authority that the panel recommended all Air Force UFO information be given to the American public. That is an inversion. The panel's actual documented recommendation was the opposite, a debunking campaign to reduce public interest, and the monitoring of civilian UFO groups. Groups, that is to say, like NICAP. NICAP printed the sunny version in good faith. The real mandate of the panel that had recommended watching them sat in a classified file. January the 22nd, 1958, CBS television. The Armstrong Circle Theater, a UFO special scripted in advance with Air Force input. Donald Kehoe, live before the nation, departs from the teleprompter to say something not previously disclosed. His microphone is cut mid-sentence. The country watches his lips move in silence. CBS later says it acted on its word security grounds. The moment becomes the founding emblem of UFO censorship, and it hardens Kehoe on the only strategy he ever really had: forced congressional hearings with the most credentialed witnesses in America at his side. That is the campaign the Admiral's signature serves. When Kehoe petitions Congress in 1962, he names his advisors in his own hand: Hillenkoetter, Fournet, Farney. And August 1960 is the high-water mark, the signed statement in the Congressional Record. A former director of Central Intelligence in the permanent record of Congress, telling the country that its government's posture on UFOs has misled it. For NICAP, it does not get better than this. It never gets better than this. February 1962. 18 months after the Congressional Record statement, with Kehoe pushing harder than ever for hearings, Hillenkoetter resigns from NICAP's board. His resignation letter strikes a note nobody expects from the movement's star witness: deference. The Air Force, he writes in substance, can do no more and should not be continually criticized. The seat does not stay empty. It passes to a man named Joseph Bryan III, and we will meet him properly in Act 3, because what NICAP's members were never told about Colonel Bryan is the hinge of the season. Why did the Admiral go? The researcher Todd Zeckel later argued, citing the Ground Saucer Watch Freedom of Information litigation of 1977 and 78, that the agency, prompted by Air Force complaints, pressured its former director off the board at precisely the moment the hearings campaign got dangerous. Say the flag, contested. Zeckel is a source this show handles with tongs, a genuine primary investigator whose own reliability is disputed, and you will hear that caution every time his name comes up tonight. The pressure claim is his reading. The timing, the deferential letter, and the psychological warfare colonel in the vacated seat, those are the record. Then come the letters. These are not contested. 1963. Hillenkoetter writes to Donald Menzel, the Harvard astronomer whose career-long project was debunking flying saucers, to praise Menzel's book for
putting to rest all surmises about flying saucers being from outer space.
In the same letter, he explains why he left NICAP. The organization, he writes, had
degenerated into a body bickering about personalities.
And in 1970, in further letters, he goes the rest of the way. He denies ever saying the objects operated under intelligent control. He states that UFOs are not extraterrestrial, that no fragments exist, that no secrecy orders were ever issued. The man NICAP held up as living proof, recanted, in private, in his own hand.
And here's the part that tells you this field has an evidence problem. Those letters didn't surface from some hostile debunkers files. They're appended to the 1987 Maccabee paper. The paper arguing Hillenkoetter was a believer on the inside, maybe even at the top of the MJ-12 list. The author attached the refutation to his own argument. One document carrying both cases, and a word about MJ-12, since that name just entered the season. Those documents get their own episode, Episode 9. And on this show's read, they are more plausibly a product of the network we're tracing than evidence of anything in the sky. Hold that thought for 2 weeks.
So which admiral do you believe? The honest answer is that the record supports 4 different men, and the show owes you all 4. Reading 1, the sincere believer, Kehoe's Hillenkoetter, who genuinely wanted disclosure and genuinely soured on a bickering organization. Reading 2, the controlled asset, Zeckel's Hillenkoetter, extended to NICAP and withdrawn on the agency's schedule. Reading 3, the sophisticated operator, Maccabee's Hillenkoetter, who knew the truth and lent his name to nudge disclosure without breaching secrecy. And reading 4, a reluctant skeptic who simply changed his mind. The reading, we are obliged to tell you, best supported by his own letters. But before we let the Admiral go, one documented thread from the government's own files, not from the UFO literature. September 1947. The CIA is not yet 4 months old, and Hillenkoetter puts a question to his own general counsel. Can the agency legally run propaganda operations? The lawyer's answer survives, and it is blunt. No. Congress never intended it. And to do it anyway, the agency would have to go back to Congress for authority and funds. 3 months later, the National Security Council hands the CIA the mission regardless. The directive comes down from above, pressed by the State Department and the Council, and the Admiral salutes and executes it. The first director of Central Intelligence, a man whose own lawyers said no before the mission arrived, who then spent his retirement as the star exhibit of a movement that psychological warfare men would help take apart. Whatever role you assign him, that irony is not a hypothesis. While the board was losing its admiral, the science was being arranged. 1966. A Michigan wave of sightings is explained away as swamp gas. The ridicule boils over into congressional pressure, and an Air Force advisory panel, the O'Brien Committee, recommends contracting universities to investigate properly. The contract lands at the University of Colorado under the physicist Edward Condon. The definitive, independent scientific study. NICAP throws its files, its case network, and its hopes behind it. Then there is the memo. In 1966, before the project is fairly underway, an internal memorandum is written by its coordinator, Robert Lowe, about how to position the study, and one word from it has followed the project ever since. The trick. The memo suggests, in substance, that the project could be presented so as to appear totally objective to the public, while being understood by the right audiences to expect a negative result. Say the flag carefully, the memo is documented. What it proves about the study's actual conduct is contested to this day. What is not contested, 2 of the project's own scientists, Saunders and Levine, were fired. The astronomers Hynek and McDonald dissented publicly, and roughly a third of the report's own cases were left unexplained. January 1969. The Condon Report is released. Its summary concludes that 21 years of UFO study have added nothing to science, and that further extensive study is not justified. The National Academy of Sciences endorses it. Reassuring words on top, a stubborn residue underneath. The same pattern this series found in 1955, and the episode simply notes it and moves on, because the effect is what matters now. On December the 17th, 1969, Air Force Secretary Robert Seamans announces the termination of Project Blue Book. After 22 years, the United States government is officially out of the flying saucer business.
NICAP bet everything on Condon. Kehoe even wrote to the Johnson White House in 1968 as the project came apart. And when the bet failed, NICAP was left holding nothing. No hearings, no study, no official adversary left to push against. An advocacy group whose reason for existing had just been formally abolished. Which brings us to a date 16 days before the Air Force announcement. Because NICAP's board didn't wait for the government to close the file. On December 3rd, 1969, 2 weeks before Seamans, NICAP beheaded itself.
December the 3rd, 1969, the NICAP board convenes. In the chair, Colonel Joseph Bryan III. Time to meet him properly. Born 1904 into the Bryan newspaper dynasty of Richmond, Virginia. Princeton, class of 1927. Associate editor of the Saturday Evening Post. Bylines in Time, Fortune, The New Yorker. A witty society author of the old school. Naval air combat intelligence in the Pacific in the Second World War. And from the late 1940s to 1953, a CIA officer running the psychological and political warfare subdivision of the Office of Policy Coordination, the agency's covert action arm. Some accounts style him the founding chief of the CIA's psychological warfare staff. That exact title traces chiefly to Zekel's interviews. Flag it. But the OPC Psy-War role stands on broader documentary ground. And one credit requires no inference at all, because it is printed on the film. Brian holds a screenwriting credit on the 1954 animated Animal Farm, the CIA's flagship culture war production, covertly financed through the agency's psychological warfare apparatus, its ending rewritten to serve the message. Not Orwell's book, the agency's film of it. State it precisely, and it needs no embellishment. The man in NICAP's chair had rewritten a story for the CIA, professionally and on the record.
12 years he sat on that board, 1957 to 1969. And as far as the record shows, the membership never knew what he'd done for a living. Compare Hillenkoetter, whose CIA past was the brochure. Same agency, opposite handling. One credential extended in public, one capability held in reserve. I can't tell you the reserve was intentional. I can tell you that when the purge came, it was the hidden one holding the gavel.
What the meeting does is documented. Donald Kehoe, director for 12 years, the man whose name was the organization, is removed. Brian has circulated a memo branding him, in a word, inept, and the working staff goes with him. Gordon Lohr, the assistant director, is fired outright. Now watch the pattern, because the archive built a control case on exactly this pair of men. Gordon Lohr, a Chesapeake oysterman's son who came to the subject through 2 sightings of his own, learned his trade on a county newspaper, and earned his place as a working editor. The UFO Investigator, The Casework, The Subcommittee Network, 2 books. Intelligence background, none. The record has been searched. No file, no clearance trail, no placement. He is the control case, and his absence of a trail is the point. It is proof the archive's method tests for intelligence ties rather than assuming them. Joseph Bryan, Publishing Dynasty, Elite Magazines, Naval Combat Intelligence, CIA Psychological Warfare. Both men were professional writer-editors, so the dividing line that night was not vocation, it was an intelligence career and a board seat. And in the event itself, the intelligence-connected board officer removed the believer investigators who did the actual work. And now the show argues with itself again, because the same control case cuts the other way. If NICAP had been an intelligence roster top to bottom, Gordon Lohr would not look the way he does. The intelligence concentration was real, but stratified. The board and the founding machinery, not the staff. And the purge's immediate beneficiaries were not obviously the agency. They were a professional manager and a board that kept its seats. That fits institutional decay inside an openly intelligence-adjacent milieu, at least as well as it fits a directed operation. And the archive's own analysis says the meeting's facts alone cannot settle the motive. What the meeting's facts do settle is the direction. Who was purged and who presided. 8 years later, Todd Zekel got the colonel on the record. Brian confirmed his CIA connections and asked that his status as a covert operative be kept private. He denied any communication with the agency during his NICAP years. He denied acting against Kehoe, a denial that NICAP's own files, as Zekel described them, contradict. All of it single source. Flag it accordingly. And told that CIA officers had penetrated NICAP at its founding, Brian offered a line that could stand as this episode's epitaph.
There was nothing to penetrate. It was all overt, the whole thing.
Self-reported, self-serving, and as Episode 6 showed, and as Act 1 showed tonight, not entirely wrong. The overlap was often overt. That is precisely what made the covert parts so hard to see. After the beheading, the ledger. NICAP in January 1970 is functionally bankrupt. The board reaches for a professional, John L. Jack A. Cuff, 37 years old, a Washington Association manager, executive director of the Society of Photographic Scientists and Engineers, and owner of Acuff Associates, a company that runs small technical organizations for a fee. In May 1970, he is elected NICAP's president, unpaid, part-time. His company, however, holds the paid management contract. What follows is not a dramatic story. That is the point of it. The confrontational campaign for hearings ends. NICAP is recast as sober and scientific. The investigative subcommittees are restructured and the inactive ones disbanded. It is in the January 1973 memo. Affiliates complain that headquarters ignores them and sits on material. Membership, which had peaked around 14,000, halves and halves again. And NICAP's own audited books preserved in the archive put the new priorities in 2 lines.
Comparative Statement of Cash Receipts and Disbursements, 1975, 1976.
Under contracting services, the fees to Acuff's own company, $34,000 to $35,000 a year. Under general research, the thing the organization existed to do, between $20 and $76, not $1,000.
That's not Zeckel's accusation. That's NICAP's own audited statement. The revenue extraction case is in the organization's own ledger. In fairness, and the record owes him the fairness, Acuff's memos to his own executive committee tell a defensible story. The group was bankrupt when he took it. His firm deferred its fees as interest-free loans. He did 30-odd radio and TV appearances a year as NICAP's spokesman. He even offered to give up the chairmanship to clean up the conflict of interest optics. A manager managing. The books don't prove intent. They prove what the organization had become. A client.
Then the list. By 1978, NICAP's principal remaining asset is its mailing list, roughly 20,000 names. In August, Acuff offers it commercially to a UFO publisher at $30 per 1,000 names. That sale is ordinary list brokerage, documented in his own letter. The infamous sale is the other one. The list was also sold, twice the modern Freedom of Information work indicates, to a Toronto operation run by Ernst Zundel, a neo-Nazi publisher trading as Samizdat, and NICAP's members began receiving Nazi propaganda in their mailboxes, bearing NICAP's own computer labels and membership codes. Whether Acuff knew what that buyer was is disputed, so this show does not carry the word knowingly. That the membership list of America's serious UFO citizenry ended up feeding a Nazi mailing operation is not disputed at all. Around the manager, the board kept its texture. In 1971, by the account of NICAP's own former insider Richard Hall, new members arrived with intelligence and defense pedigrees. A career CIA officer, though that one rests on Hall's account alone, with no independent record found, and we flag it. A heavily documented Air Force brigadier general from the Cold War's nuclear strategy world, a former State Department information officer. And in 1978 came the best documented of them all, Charles Lombard, a Senate aide from Barry Goldwater's orbit, whom the CIA's own Legislative Council Journal, in November 1975, records running interference for the agency during the Church and Pike investigations, and asking for an agency job once they ended. That is a primary government record from outside the UFO literature entirely. And Acuff himself? Zeckel claimed the manager had been approached by Soviet agents. His professional society was full of government photo interpretation people and a foreign intelligence target, that he reported the approach and then met the Soviets under FBI direction, acting, in Zeckel's phrase, in effect as a covert agent. Contested. And here the modern records are a masterpiece of ambiguity. The CIA answers the Freedom of Information request with a Glomar response, refusing to confirm or deny that records exist, and the FBI confirms records in an investigative file. Hear the discipline. A Glomar is not a confession. An investigative file can mean subject, witness, or informant. Open questions, not findings. The end is quick and quiet. September 1978, The executive board's private assessment, preserved in a set of meeting notes.
John Acuff is on the way out.
Membership, about 1,200. In October, Acuff is forced out as president, keeping tellingly a board seat and custody of the files, and he will still be signing as president into the final negotiations. Who succeeded him is itself contested. Two independent accounts say a retired CIA employee named Alan N. Hall, a man so obscure that no independent biography of him has ever surfaced. A third account, built on Freedom of Information records, says a different retired CIA officer, Harry Cooper. Weigh that sentence. The dispute about who ran NICAP at the end is a dispute over which retired CIA man it was. In 1981, the remains, the name, the files, the list, are transferred to the Center for UFO Studies for $3,000 and a contingency note. At the end of 1981, NICAP, the organization that once put an admiral's demand for the truth into the Congressional Record, is dissolved.
Zeckel called it a playbook. Infiltrate through a trusted figure, neutralize the accountability advocates, convert the organization into a passive data collector, and let it decline. He thought he was describing NICAP. The archive traces the same shape forward into organizations that didn't exist yet in 1969. But that's for later episodes. Here's what I keep coming back to. To kill NICAP, nobody needed to burn a file or fake a saucer. It took a resignation letter, a board memo, a management contract, and a ledger. Capture doesn't look like a coup. It looks like minutes of a meeting, approved without objection.
The deception lesson of the long capture. Run the grammar one more time. The seed was credibility itself, an admiral's name, extended. The amplifier was the Congressional Record and the Evening News. The management was a board seat here, a resignation there, a science study position before it began. And the harvest was silence. A movement that entered the 1960s demanding hearings left the 1970s as a mailing list, sold twice. Who benefits? On the documented record, everyone who preferred the UFO question domesticated. The Air Force, out of the business by Christmas 1969. The intelligence community, whose 1953 panel had recommended watching the civilian groups, and whose veterans were, at the end, the only people left in the building. And whoever, in the decades ahead, would prefer that the citizens asking the sharpest questions had no organization left to ask them through. That the outcome served those interests is documented. That it was ordered remains contested. This episode was built to keep both of those sentences true at once. Next time on the deception thread. The old organizations are dead, and the next deception doesn't infiltrate a movement. It builds a citizen from scratch and hands him a document. A New Mexico businessman films the lights over a nuclear weapons base, and the men from Air Force counterintelligence come to his door, not to stop him, to encourage him. It is the episode every earlier episode has been pointing to, and this one is no hypothesis. It is admitted, on the record, by the men who did it. Episode 8, The Cornerstone.
Thank you for taking the time to listen. Remember, we don't teach you what to believe, we teach you how to think. This is The Circle Jerk.